The rusted iron gates of Blackwood Asylum groaned in protest as Elias squeezed through the narrow gap. A cold drizzle clung to his waterproof jacket, turning the surrounding forest into a dense, oppressive wall of mist and shadow. He had been chasing the rumors of Blackwood for months, a sprawling 19th-century psychiatric facility abandoned in the early 70s following a string of unexplained disappearances, both staff and patient. The official reports claimed structural decay and funding cuts. Local legends whispered of something far worse. As he stood in the overgrown courtyard, Elias couldn't help but feel a pervasive sense of wrongness. The architecture, an imposing Victorian Gothic monstrosity of blackened brick and shattered glass, was being aggressively devoured by the encroaching wilderness. It wasn't the slow, patient reclamation of nature that he was used to seeing in forgotten places. This was something else entirely. Thick, dark vines, the color of bruised veins, snaked up the cracked masonry with an unnatural vigor, pulling the stonework apart not with time, but with what almost seemed like intent. The flora here looked sickly, bloated, and wrong. He adjusted the strap of his high-powered flashlight and stepped through the decaying wooden frame of what was once the main entrance. The air inside hit him like a physical blow, heavy, damp, and carrying the unmistakable, cloying sweetness of rot. It smelled of wet earth and something metallic, like old blood mixed with decaying vegetation. His beam cut through the gloom, revealing a massive reception area stripped of anything valuable decades ago. The floorboards were entirely hidden beneath a thick carpet of pale, spongy moss that silenced his footsteps. Strange, bulbous fungi clung to the peeling wallpaper, their caps an unhealthy, mottled purple. As Elias moved deeper into the asylum, the temperature seemed to drop precipitously. He was drawn toward the east wing, where the records indicated the most severe cases had been housed. The hallway was a tunnel of despair. The heavy iron doors of the cells rusted open like gaping mouths. It was here that the true extent of the overgrowth became apparent. The vines he had seen outside had breached the walls, bursting through the plaster like alien tendrils, but they were changing. Where the vines met the remnants of the asylum's infrastructure, a rusted wheelchair, a heavy iron bed frame, they didn't just grow over it. They seemed to be trying to integrate with it. Elias paused, shining his light on a particularly thick cluster of roots wrapped around a discarded medical cart. He leaned in closer, his breath catching in his throat. The roots were pulsing. It was a slow, rhythmic movement, like a sluggish heartbeat. A profound sense of unease settled over him, urging him to turn back, but the morbid curiosity that drove all urban explorers pushed him forward. He needed to find the treatment rooms. He needed to see what secrets Blackwood had buried. He found the central medical theater at the end of a long, descending corridor. The double doors hung off their hinges, revealing a large, circular room dominated by a rusted surgical table in the center. The smell here was overpowering, a sickening blend of formaldehyde and the sweet rot of the pulsing vines. The walls of the theater were completely covered in the unnatural flora. The vines here were thicker, engorged, and weeping a dark, sap-like substance that stained the tiled floor. But it was what hung from the ceiling that made Elias' blood run cold. Suspended above the surgical table by a web of the dark, pulsing roots was a massive, bulbous sack of translucent, papery material. It looked like a hideous, oversized chrysalis. Inside, something was moving. Elias stumbled back, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The beam swept across the room, illuminating the dark corners he had previously ignored. The walls weren't just covered in vines. They were lined with shapes, humanoid shapes. He forced himself to look, his mind screaming in denial. The figures were embedded within the root system, their bodies fused with the unnatural plant life. They were patients, or perhaps staff, their forms twisted and distorted by decades of agonizing transformation. Branches sprouted from their eye sockets and mouths, roots burrowing deep into their chests, weaving through ribs and wrapping around decaying organs. They weren't dead. As Elias' light washed over them, a chorus of wet, tearing sounds filled the room. The embedded figures twitched, their limbs straining against the wooden bonds that had grown through their flesh. Eyes, milky and blind, fluttered open. Mouths, stretched wide by thick, woody protrusions, released silent, agonizing screams. The asylum hadn't been abandoned. It had been planted. Elias realized with a sickening jolt that the rumors of experimental treatments weren't completely false. They had just misunderstood the nature of the experiment. The doctors hadn't been trying to cure the mind. They had been feeding the forest. They had found something ancient and hungry in the woods, something that required a very specific type of fertilizer: human pain, madness, and flesh. A sudden, sharp snapping sound drew his attention back to the center of the room. The massive chrysalis above the surgical table was tearing open. Thick, viscous fluid poured out, splashing onto the rusted metal below. From the tear emerged a limb. It was an impossible amalgamation of human anatomy and twisted flora, a muscular arm terminating not in fingers, but in sharp, woody talons, the skin a mottled blend of pale flesh and rough bark. Panic, raw and absolute, seized Elias. He turned and ran. He tore through the corridors, the silence of the asylum shattered by the sounds of the waking horrors behind him. The rustling of leaves sounded like a hurricane, accompanied by the wet, tearing noise of bodies ripping themselves free from the walls. The vines themselves seemed to come alive, slithering across the floor, reaching out to trip him, to drag him into the dark. He scrambled up the stairs, his lungs burning, his flashlight beam bouncing erratically off the decaying walls. The air grew thicker, choking him with spores that tasted of ash and decay. He could feel them settling in his lungs, a cold, invasive presence that made him hack and wheeze. As he reached the main reception area, the building groaned, a deep structural shifting that sent dust and debris raining down from the ceiling. The heavy wooden frame of the main entrance was blocked. A massive wall of thick, pulsing roots had erupted from the floorboards, sealing the exit completely. Elias frantically searched for another way out, his light sweeping the room. The windows were shattered, but the iron bars remained unyielding, thick vines weaving between them like a cage. He was trapped. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, the heavy, uneven footfalls of things that used to be human, the tearing of wood, the wet slithering of roots. They were coming from the east wing, from the basement, from everywhere. He backed away from the sealed entrance, retreating toward the center of the reception area. The moss beneath his feet seemed thicker now, softer, almost yielding. He looked down and watched in horror as the pale green carpet began to creep up over his boots, tiny hair-like roots boring through the leather, seeking the warm flesh beneath. Elias screamed, kicking wildly, but the moss was incredibly strong, anchoring him to the floor. The roots moved with terrifying speed, wrapping around his ankles, climbing his calves, their tiny barbs tearing through his jeans and biting into his skin. He fell backward, landing hard on the yielding floor. Immediately, the moss surged over his back, pinning his arms, creeping toward his neck. The pain was excruciating, 1,000 tiny needles injecting a numbing, paralyzing toxin into his bloodstream. From the shadows of the corridors, the horrors emerged. They were a grotesque mockery of life, their bodies a horrifying fusion of rotting flesh and aggressive, parasitic plant life. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, their blind, milky eyes fixed on him, drawn to his terror, his struggling life force. Leading them was the creature from the chrysalis. It stood 7 feet tall, its body a terrifying monument to the forest's revenge. Its flesh was a patchwork of bark and human skin, its face a smooth, featureless mask of polished wood save for a vertical slit that opened to reveal rows of sharp, splintered teeth. Elias couldn't move. The paralyzing toxin had taken hold, leaving him a helpless prisoner in his own body. He could only watch as the creatures formed a circle around him, their twisted, woody appendages reaching out. The towering creature stepped forward, its talons clicking against the rusted debris on the floor. It loomed over Elias, a god of rot and overgrowth, claiming its latest sacrifice. As the creature reached down, its wooden talons plunging into Elias' chest, he didn't feel the pain of the wound. Instead, he felt a sudden, terrifying connection. He felt the cold, ancient hunger of the forest, the slow, relentless patience of the roots. He felt the millions of fungal spores taking root in his lungs, his bloodstream, his brain. He was no longer Elias. He was the soil. He was the fertilizer. He was the next bloom in the endless, horrifying garden of Blackwood Asylum. And as his vision faded into a dark, verdant green, he realized with final, crushing despair that he would be awake for every agonizing second of the transformation.